Mike, last week you did an unbelievable job summarizing the rise of Al Qaeda and jihadi terrorism, going all the way back to the Soviet Afghan War, 1989, and brought us all the way to the late 1990s. So today, we have a special guest. We brought on our colleague Spencer Schecht, who, if you watch this show, you've known he's been on before. And Spencer, thanks for coming on. How are you doing today?
Yeah, great to be back with you guys. I'm doing great. I'm pretty pumped to be talking about 9/11 with you both here. And I just want to say here at the top, so I'm a New Yorker. I was born in New York. I was raised in New York. And the Twin Towers loomed large in my imagination and in my upbringing. And I remember thinking that these buildings represented just progress and the future. I remember thinking, like, these are what buildings are supposed to look like, and the way they towered over the city and stood apart from everything else. That's what they were supposed to do, but also in the imagination of a young child growing up in New York, it really represented so much. And you could say I grew up in the shadows of the towers, which was violently, suddenly interrupted, and then we all grew up in the shadow of 9/11 instead. And I took it for granted. I was just old enough to kind of conceive of what was happening, but I didn't really understand it. And I would say that my renewed interest in 9/11 came around the 20th anniversary when we were all being bombarded with interviews and the remembrance and the memorials and things. And it got me thinking, sort of like, I really need to dig into this. I really need to understand how this happened, and I want to understand the hijackers and all of this. And I sort of kind of started unspooling the story, and I got more and more interested in this. And it occurred to me that this is a conversation that is not yet over, and that there's a whole lot that we still don't understand about why this happened. And we ought to still be curious and indeed incredulous about this towards our government and towards the sort of, I guess I would even say, like, the human nature of how this all happened. And there's still outstanding questions that we ought to still be outraged by and still be asking today. Why is it that the CIA broke protocol to not share information with the FBI? How come Ali Soufan, who was investigating the Cole bombing, was begging the CIA for information about the Kuala Lumpur meeting, and he wasn't granted access to that information until after the 9/11 attacks? How come these terrorists were able to enter the United States legally and live under their real names and carry out these attacks? How come folks such as George Tenet of the CIA and Richard Clarke of the who was basically the counterterrorism czar for the executive branch at that time, was begging Condoleezza Rice and the Bush administration to take Al Qaeda seriously? So these are still things that should be addressed today, and I think is important for Americans in 2024 and beyond to take seriously.
Yeah. Well, Spencer, that's an awesome start because, like I said in the intro, I appreciate the background of why you are so in depth on this topic, and that's exactly why we wanted to bring you on. Is you haven't spent hundreds of hours, you've spent thousands of hours reading this material, the books, the documents, the memos, watching documentaries, and reading firsthand accounts and memoirs. I mean, the breadth of your knowledge is really impressive, and that's the whole reason we're doing this series. Is could this happen again today? And as we kind of said, Mike, please make me feel better. Please make me feel better in part one. Well, I think all three of us are kind of in agreement here that something like this could happen again today. And it's about talking about those blind spots and how it was allowed to happen, or how they flew under the radar, no pun intended, and crashed into those buildings. So today's an extremely important conversation. And with that, I'd like to start after where we left off in episode 1. Again, if you haven't watched that, it's linked below. Go watch episode 1, but part 1. But part 2 here, we would like to start, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, in a specific cell of the terrorists in Germany. Is that correct?
Yeah. So when we talk about 9/11, people think Osama bin Laden, but there were really key characters. There were 4 key characters that made 9/11 possible, and that, of course, were the pilots on 9/11. And 3 of them came from what is known as the Hamburg cell, and that's how they're identified in the 9/11 Commission report. And it's important to kind of unpack all what was happening at that time. So there was a particular kind of radical Islam that was spreading across the non-Arab world at this time in the late 1990s. And this delineation is important because in some of these Islamic rule countries, they would suppress these radical movements because it posed a threat to their rule. But in places like Germany, where the cell kind of like came of age, they were allowed to prosper and indeed plan terrorist activities. And Germany was a really interesting place because in this sort of this pendulum swing away from National Socialism, they became hyper liberal. And there was basically a hands-off policy. And although these folks were on the radar, so to speak, for the German authorities, they were allowed to do what they did and to sort of spread these radical ideas. It was totally okay. And there was this cottage industry of radical Islam that was being sort of nurtured and harbored at that time, where it was when these gentlemen were away from their home countries, they were able to rally around Islam and their religion as kind of a unifying principle. And within that, it was also the same time when imams and traveling speakers essentially were whipping people up into this frenzy that the greatest service that they could have as Muslims was to serve God as jihadists and die for the cause. And die for the cause, killing the enemy. And the enemy were Westerners, they were Jews, they were Americans. Because the sentiment was that there's a crusade against the Islamic world, and it's being led by the Americans, by the West, by the Jews, and that it is the duty of every Muslim to stand up and be a warrior in that fight. So this is the sort of environment in which these young men, these are young men, and they came from a non-religious background. And I'm actually going to quote right now from the book Perfect Soldiers by Terry McDermott. Most of the men of September 11 came from apolitical and unexceptional backgrounds. They evolved into devout, pious young men who over time drew deeper and deeper into Islam. As they did, they debated endlessly how to best serve their God and how to fulfill what they came to regard as sacred obligations. They saw themselves as soldiers of God. So these were young men that were sort of, their highest calling was to become more and more entrenched into Islam. And this was at the same time when these jihadi camps were being operated in Afghanistan. And this is a completely different era now, right? If you go back to the 90s, that these cells and these camps were being allowed to operate. So it was essentially jihadi summer camp that were being run out of Afghanistan, and Osama bin Laden and others were running these camps. And it was sort of a rite of passage for young Arab Muslim men to go to these camps. It's like, we're going to go to the camps, we're going to get some training, and we're going to carry out the jihad. And this was sort of a non-serious idea for an outsider because they were almost sort of goofy in their way. And sure, there were small one-off terrorist acts going on, but they were allowed to prosper in these camps. And so
let me ask a question, Spence. So I guess what I recall from the last part of this was that we asked Sudan's government to kick out these terrorists and basically said, if you harbor them, then you're aiding them. Am I jumping around in the story, or is it we've told countries before, hey, eliminate these terrorist cells, eliminate these training camps, or we're going to hold you basically in cahoots with them? I mean, I understand Germany was very liberal at that time, and they likely had this freedom of speech, and they're not breaking any laws right now. Mm-hmm. But what was the U.S.'s stance on that?
So this is where this is again one of the many factors that makes this such a upsetting story. Is that it was really sort of ad hoc, and there was a lot of underlying sort of political 4D chess that was going on, that for whatever reason, Afghanistan was a no man's land, and they had just no jurisdiction. They had no leverage. They had no diplomatic ties in order to force these camps to shut down or to extradite any of these people. But the key piece here is that you have these young men, particularly in Hamburg, where they're all they're talking about, all they're thinking about is how to best serve their God. And so these three young men, took a trip to Afghanistan in late 1999. And this was quite a momentous decision. So these three young men was Mohammed Atta, it was Zaya Jara, and Marwan al-Shehi. And these would be three of the four pilots on 9/11. And so they had traveled to Afghanistan in late 1999 to make their pilgrimage to the jihad camps and find out how they could best wage jihad. And this was right at the same time that KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, had been approved by Osama bin Laden to carry out the planes operation. And KSM, who is maybe an underappreciated, he's not like a household name in this, but you may have heard of him before. He was sort of like he was the big ideas person, but he was also involved tactically in training these terrorists. And he had this grandiose idea. They're going to hijack 10 airliners at the same time, and they're going to crash some, and then he's going to land one, and he's going to kill all the males. He's going to release the women and children, and then make a big statement, a big speech denouncing the West, right? And so Osama bin Laden's like, okay, you got big ideas. That's pretty crazy. Let's slim it down. Like, how can we actually operationalize this? And so he gave him the go-ahead to kind of like figure out the planes operation. They were trying to move this forward with a few of their trusted associates in the camps at the time. They were working with some Yemenis, but the geopolitical situation at the time is Yemenis couldn't get into the U.S. because they were viewed as economic migrants. So they had a lot of Yemenis that they trusted here, but it wasn't working out. And then all of a sudden, just as fate would have it, these three men walk into the camps right as they're trying to figure out the planes operation. And they've got fairly good English. They're not Yemeni. In fact, Mohammed Atta is Egyptian. Jara is, I believe he's from Lebanon. And then al-Shehi, he's from the UAE. So they would have no problems getting into the States. They're educated. And they're identified by the leadership at the time, and they're invited to break the 1999 Ramadan fast with Osama bin Laden. And this is happening in mid-December of 1999. And after some casual conversation, Osama says, how would you like to be martyrs? How would you like to wage your war against the United States? And they essentially said, okay, so if you want to be a part of this, I want you to start training to be a pilot and get into the United States as fast as possible. And all three of them basically said, okay, sounds like a plan, let's go. And within weeks, we see that the plan is in action. In fact, on January 3rd, 2000, Shehi orders pilot training. He orders a online video training course, which is the first concrete evidence of flying in the plot. And they start working on their visas. They cancel their passports. They mark them as stolen so that they can cover their tracks from coming out of Afghanistan. And they start working their way into the United States.
Wow. So that's all 23 months prior to the attack is we're downloading flight simulators and learning about a plane's operation, essentially.
Right. And so that's happening. And then at the same time, there's a very, very important piece that happens as well. So some of these trusted associates of Osama bin Laden and these jihadis, they're called to a meeting in Kuala Lumpur. And now the CIA knew that something was afoot, and they had actually asked officials there to spy on this. And they had they did not wiretap the conversation, which could have blown the lid off the plot at that point. But they had some photographs, and this is going to become important down the line because there were two attendees of this meeting. Men by the name of Midhar and Hazmi, who attended this meeting and then would, just a week later, on January 15th, fly to the United States with American visas and enter the country. And these would be like the original sleeper cells. These were the first folks who would participate in 9/11 to enter the United States. But the CIA knew. The CIA knew that there was something afoot here. And they let them come into the country, and they started spying on them at that time in March of 2000. So this is a full 18 months before 9/11. But they were obliged to tell the FBI. They were supposed to tell the FBI because the FBI had the jurisdiction to actively pursue these people in the United States, which the CIA did not. And this is one of the many drop balls in the build-up to 9/11. You know, if the FBI was allowed to investigate these people and to follow them and eventually arrest and interrogate them, again, another missed opportunity there. But they didn't. And there's more to be said about these individuals. They would eventually go on to be some muscle hijackers on Flight 77, which would eventually crash into the Pentagon. But again, this is a long runway. I think the popular opinion about 9/11 is it just sort of like it came up out of nowhere. How did we see this coming? How did we not see this coming? It just happened so fast. But yeah, the CIA was aware that these Al-Qaeda terrorists were in the country in early 2000.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to take a moment here and just kind of summarize everything, right? So we have the early formation of what would soon become the Al-Qaeda cell after the Afghan Civil War back in '89 at its ending, and it's some of those same reasons. It's the foundations for this radical form of Islam, and it speaks to the commitment and their dedication to this cause, right? So we're talking about a 20-year mission at this point, reviving what was this, the early Bojinka plot, right, Spence? So that was the Bojinka plot was this grand mastermind plan by KSM. But the reason why a lot of this is flying below the radar is because, as you were mentioning before, there was a lot of 4D political chess kind of going on. So you have the Clinton administration not really responding promptly enough to the U.S. Embassy bombings, the simultaneous attacks on 2 out of the 3, and then the USS Cole bombing. So you have these 2 events prior to it that are really the early testing grounds that maybe Al-Qaeda wasn't directly hand involved in the embassy bombings itself, but they were funding these cells and the training and providing supplies for those individuals. And this was their early groundwork to get going. And now we come up on this cusp of the transfer between the 2 administrations. So we have Bill Clinton distracted by the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and then we have the Supreme Court kind of dragging out, deciding who the next president's going to be. These are critical times when an administration is normally filling many of its positions, refining its policy objectives, like what it's going to be doing through its administration. So it's just unfortunate how it seems to have caught us at this perfect storm of weakness in our political attention. So I think it's important that it really, we encapsulate all of that before we move on to the story here.
Yeah, and just to clarify, the reason the Supreme Court was deciding an election in that case was the hanging Chad controversy in Florida between Al Gore and George W. Bush. The votes were not clear, so they took weeks and weeks to hand count all of the paper, and I guess rule on how that happened.
Yeah,
so,
and that was one of the a single card stacked up in this house of cards that led to 9/11, and we were truly distracted at that point. And as Mike mentioned, the handover couldn't have been sloppier because there was a lot of consternation that people were at loggerheads with this whole situation. The Democrats in power, the Clinton administration, didn't feel like it was a legitimate transfer of power. And when the Bush administration came in, they basically took the position of whatever Clinton said was important, we're not going to take as important because we're just trying to do the opposite of whatever they were doing. And, Clinton would later go on and say, my biggest regret is that I couldn't get bin Laden for you, he said to Bush. But I wonder, if he actually said that or if he's covering up his tracks. But there's something else that's happening at the same time, which is that there's actors in the government that that really understand the threat that's underway at this point. So as Mike mentioned, there were the embassy bombings in 1998, and we had a proportional response to that. We did it as we would respond to another nation state. So they said, okay, you blew up 2 embassies. We had 2 separate rocket attacks, blew up some camps, blew up a factory in Sudan, and all for naught. If anything, it emboldened the terrorists. It pointed out that, okay, if the United States is actually responding to this, then we're doing a good job. We're on track. We're provoking the beast. But the first week of that administration, in January of 2001, before their offices are set up, you could think, Condoleezza Rice gets a memo from Richard Clarke, who's another key figure here. He was essentially the terrorism czar that sat across all these organizations, and he was supposed to be like a key intelligence individual. And you could read this memo online. It was declassified in 2006. And in this memo, again, in the first week of the Bush administration, he's telling Condoleezza Rice, who's the national security advisor, he says, Al-Qaeda is an urgent transnational threat, and this needs immediate attention and instructions on key issues. Number 1, do we send assistance to the Northern Alliance? Number 2, we need more money for the CIA counterterrorism budget. Number 3, we need a definitive response to the Cole bombing. And so I will quote from this memo that Richard Clarke said Condoleezza Rice. And he says, "Today we propose major presidential policy reviews or initiatives. We urgently need such a principles review on the al-Qaeda network. As we noted in briefings for you, al-Qaeda is not so narrow little terrorist issue that needs to be included in broader regional policy. Rather, several of our regional policies need to address essentially the transnational challenge to the U.S. and our interests posed by the al-Qaeda network. We would make a major error if we underestimate the challenge of al-Qaeda or underestimated the stability of the moderate friendly regimes al-Qaeda threatens." So he's basically saying right from the jump, we need to pay attention to this network. This is something that should be top priority. And he will later say in testimony to the 9/11 Commission, he was essentially ignored. This urgent meeting that he was requesting wasn't organized until the summer of 2001.
Yeah, so it's important. I want to interject here because I think it really you have to finish off on one note here is we're coming off of the Cold War and we just won it, and our entire intelligence apparatus is focused on fighting nation states. Hence some of the incorrect responses to the emerging threat at the time, right? It spoke to the asymmetry of the issue. The camps in this factory in Sudan, they're such small footprints, and the amorphous al-Qaeda organization could just move to a new area and set up new training camps in no time. So what was happening was we had an entire intelligence apparatus that was designed for the wrong threat. And then even more importantly, we were coming off of a couple decades of cooling down, right? So, or rather a decade and a half of cooling down. So we were, decreasing our budgets and trying to show good faith towards the collapsing Soviet Union and emerging, Russian Federation, that we're minimizing our defense budgets, we're minimizing our espionage budgets and our intelligence gathering budgets. And arguably, we're entering a world that's more complex than it was then. And I don't want to jump the gun too much, but just post 9/11, the budget increases and all these things, all these attention that it would get later is still only approaching Cold War levels, right? So it still seems insufficient for these threats. So that's kind of what's happening here, right? Is we have people in the government who do seem to know or at least can understand this threat for what it is. They don't have the resources and they're not given the attention because it's just not seen as that big of a threat yet. But that's always the hindsight is 20/20 of it all.
Yeah, I mean, the same way that it's interesting for me, and I'm going to keep hearkening back to this not so rhetorical question of could all of this happen again? And what I'm hearing is we are questioning the integrity of an election, and the election processes are ongoing and tumultuous. Now there's a transfer of power from presumably Democrat to Republican, and a lot of the priorities of the previous administration are being deliberately overturned or ignored for political reasons. And then we have this threat and this intelligence community that's not set up properly, or to hearken to today, people are complaining about it or saying they're too involved or they're too large or they wield too much power. So the three hallmarks of what created this lapse in attention and the open door for these folks to come into this country appear to be kind of aligning as well today. And that's, again, why we're doing this series right now. So just to put a fine point on that, that's a lot of overlap.
Yeah, so no, that is the perfect segue into the next segment. I want to definitely, hand this one off to Spencer, but it's what we're about to see now in this next segment is the porous borders and how those hijackers infiltrated the United States. So we kind of alluded to that before. They abused the visa process and how they got in, but also when they got here, the ones that were of concern were not watched, right? So let's throw that over to you, Spence.
Sure. So what's interesting about 9/11 is that all of these hijackers came into the country through legal means. They lied on their visa application. They manipulated their passports, and some of them failed to show financial solvency, which is something that they needed in order to qualify for their visa. But none of that mattered. All 19 hijackers came in legally. And to note that there was an active suspicion from the FBI that something was going on, and that there was something called the wall between FBI and the CIA, where it was institutionalized after 1995. Some executive order sort of put some guidelines around how the FBI and the CIA were allowed to share information, and individuals within the CIA blew this up to be a larger barrier than it needed to be. And in fact, it became this institutionalized issue that allowed this information to go unshared. So at the same time that these hijackers are coming in, Hamzi and Midhar, so they are being followed by the CIA, and they should have been handed over to the FBI. The FBI should have been investigating them, but the CIA, and there's some speculation here that the very sore FBI agents have speculated to journalists that they thought they were trying to turn these people, or that they were going to be, kind of managed through Saudi officials, but they weren't. So these terrorists come into the country. And so the first terrorists arrive in January, as we mentioned, but then these three key individuals arrive in the spring of 2000. And so this would be those three individuals that we talked about earlier from the Hamburg cell. So this would be Zara, Shehi, and Atta, and they enter the country. And personally, I think that 9/11 wouldn't have played out the way it did if it wasn't for this key individual, Mohammed Atta, who he came in. He's Egyptian. He actually defended his graduate thesis in 1999. He was an incredibly focused person, an incredibly devout Muslim. And I think today he might even be considered on the spectrum in that he was almost robotically focused on individual outcomes. And he had become this incredibly radicalized Muslim man that all he could do and all he could think about was how to serve Allah, but also he understood the political implications of doing so. And he really felt like he was on a mission to counter that Christian Western American crusade against the Muslim world. But, so essentially he was the operational commander of 9/11. And so the way that this all worked out was that these pilots were going to kind of manage their own teams. The pilots came into the country and they immediately start training as pilots. So they start taking pilot training lessons immediately. They're getting flight hours. They're getting hours in the simulator, and they're just skilling up. And that's all they're focused on. Is that they led these like kind of uneventful existences for the time that they were in the States. That they essentially ate, slept, prayed, and went to flight school. That's all they did. And so they're being kind of cultivated in the United States, and they're training for their mission. And then the fourth pilot is sort of this, by chance, is this man named Hani Handra. He's a Saudi who wanders into an Afghan camp in late 2000, and they recognize that he actually already has his commercial pilot's license, and he's lived in the United States. And what do you know? They're looking for another pilot. So they send him over to the States as well, and he links up with Midhar and Hamzi. And that's it. They start bringing in these terrorists into the United States. So by the beginning of 2001, the four pilots are in the U.S. And so then they start moving over what was going to be called the muscle hijackers, the hit teams. And the original plan called for 4 teams of 5 terrorists. And there was going to be 1 pilot. That's all you need to pilot the plane. And then there are going to be 4 people to overpower the crew and any passengers and manage the plane while they're able to carry out their attack.
To show you, how important and still relevant that this is today, Spence, I'm sure you've probably heard of or seen of it, the al-Bayoumi video that had surfaced, I think about a month or so ago from the timing of this. Maybe you could elucidate a little bit more on how important that character is to this story, right? So he's one of the people who helps them get established early on, and his story, it sounds very questionable as time has gone on and we re-examine it.
Okay, so let's rewind again to mid-January 2000. The Midhar and Hazmi come into the United States, and they meet a man by the name of Bayoumi and at a halal cafe in LA. And Bayoumi will later testify, that he happened upon these people. He heard some young men talking in Gulf accents. He went over and he talked to them, and he found out they were new in the country. And hey, we were just going to help him out of the goodness of his heart. And he ends up setting them up in apartments in San Diego. And there's a lot of questionable activity here because he had connections back to the Saudi consulate, the embassy. And we later find out this was just released this year there's footage of him in Washington, D.C. prior to the attacks, filming what could only be described as a casing video, where he's showcasing all of the monuments, the White House, the Capitol building, where they are relative to landmarks that are easily seen from the sky, like the Washington Monument.
Observing security measures and things around them. Like, it's, I mean, you'd have to be naive to not see this as a casing video, right?
Right. So basically the two first terrorists that arrived in the United States in 2000, they come in, they meet this, according to him, they meet by chance, which there's no way they were meeting by chance. And they get set up, even though they get set up because they can't speak English. They were supposed to learn how to fly. They couldn't do that. So they were basically sitting tight until other pilots could come in and join the plot. And what's difficult about this story is under most of the pebbles that you overturn in the 9/11 story, the Saudis are there. There's concrete evidence of this gentleman Bayoumi, but then also there's concrete evidence that the wife of the Saudi ambassador was funding these terrorists as well. So and then 2 days after 9/11, on 9/13, all of the Saudi diplomats in the nation are able to fly out immediately after the travel ban is lifted. So these are some curious components to the whole story, which, again, haven't been actually addressed, haven't been properly addressed even 23 years later.
I'm kind of surprised to hear that, because I know that as part of kind of the preparation for this, and like I kind of said in the beginning, you've just been interested in this for many years. You've obviously read through the 9/11 Commission report, and I'm going to wave my hand and be the first to admit I have not read through the whole 9/11 Commission report. But I would imagine that full investigations had been done into al-Bayoumi. They searched his house. They haven't found a video until this year. Could you tell me a little bit more about how that surfaced?
That's a great question. Again, these are active conversations, and that I still think, when I watch the footage of what happened on 9/11, how can we not still be angry at this? We should still be vigilant, and we should still be curious, and we should still be angry at what happened, and try to understand exactly sort of the missed opportunities so that we can prevent them in the future. And I don't have a good answer for you. I wish I did. I really wish I did. And a lot of people that are close to this, when you read sort of these journalists and you read these books and you watch these interviews, they don't understand it either. And they are still scratching their head on how this was all able to happen, and how all of the ties to the Saudi government sort of just get swept up in the narrative as if they were all coincidences.
So I think we tend to forget, because the grander the story, the more the components of it, the people, we don't see them as people. We just see them as the cogs in the machine of the story. But this is really a testament to a lot of the personalities and the intersections between those personalities. So your job in the intelligence community is to convey your analysis in the most conveying and compelling and convincing ways possible to the principals, i.e. the presidential administration, the lever pullers, and get things done. And that's a difficult thing, right? When you mix politics in all of this, so that's what makes it so complex. And when people say they're frustrated by politics, they don't see why it's important, and it's kind of a moot point, because it is the science of action, is how I've heard politics described before, and that's exactly what happened here, or rather a failure thereof. Many key people in the intelligence community were screaming their heads off, and the principals didn't listen, or they weren't assigning the resources, which I think is a tremendous point of it. I mean, going all the way up to the attack, right? I mean, there were some people who were turned away, but there were some people who were let in, in the last few months before the operation. Is that right?
Yeah. And it's also really important to kind of double click on that, is that the one of the key themes in the 9/11 breakdown is that there was actually interpersonal issues between the FBI and the CIA, which totally interfered and destroyed their ability to cooperate. So there were two separate teams. There's the I-49 team, which is the FBI team looking at this, and the Alex station, which is the CIA segment, looking specifically at bin Laden. And they couldn't get along. That there were two gentlemen that head up these teams, and they together hated one another. But they both fundamentally understood the threat that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda posed. And Yet their interpersonal differences, the friction between them, prevented them from preventing the attacks. Which is, it's truly an ultimate irony. It's truly a tragedy in the true sense of the word, because these were people that understood what could happen and were trying, like, sleepless nights, working so hard to kind of get to the bottom of this. But because they couldn't work together, 9/11 was allowed to happen the way it did.
Well, it's another point that I'm just going to highlight as right now in our country, we have this heightened state of partisan divide. And that's the goal of this show, is to bridge that gap between Mike and I and talk about the different policies on both sides. Now, I don't want to attribute the CIA and the FBI knocking heads to be partisan. Of course, the brave men and women of the intelligence communities, which I truly believe that, are doing their best. And I believe that they stay apolitical because the threat is more important than the politics. But what I would say is that this harkens back, again, to the validity or the true warning signs that are going off. What if our House can't communicate? What if our Senate can't communicate? That's arguably worse than, in some cases, the intelligence communities. So this is very alarming indeed, because this is exactly what we see time and time again. Okay, wow. Intelligence failures. We've got hijackers, trained commercial pilots now with muscle behind them in the States. They're now planning their attacks. Mike, what's next? Where do we go from here?
I think there's just a couple pieces left, and we need to include here. Definitely the Zacarias Moussaoui saga. Definitely have to include that. It's really important. The Mohammed al-Qahtani at the last moments being turned away, I think, is important to understand. That while it was a slight disruption to the plot, it was unfortunately, still not enough to give us insights into the plot happening, on a larger scale than simply just someone not having their paperwork filed correctly.
So we haven't heard those names before. Can you be more clear? Zacarias Moussaoui was who, and what happened to him?
Basically, this guy shows up to flight school, and he is aggressive, and he's saying, I want to learn how to fly the biggest jets, and I don't care if we could learn if I learn how to land them. And so immediately, the flight school is like, that's alarming. So 2 days later, the FBI is at the school, and they're interviewing this guy, and they arrest him on like a visa violation or something like that. And we're talking about mid-August of 2001. And so now this is
just a few weeks before the attacks.
And it's worth going into the 9/11 Commission report to analyze this segment, because the FBI agent that's interviewing this person, he's got red flags going off all over the place. He's like, okay, you got all this money in your bank account. You can't tell me where it came from. You can't tell me what you're doing in the States. And he says, okay, I need a warrant to search this guy's computer. That was caught up in the, bureaucratic gears up until 9/11. And he was never granted access. He was never granted any access into that, a warrant into the computer until 2 days after 9/11. And so,
to interject, just so people understand, the FBI structure changes dramatically after 9/11 because of this specific incident and a few others, but chiefly they look at this incident, and it's because there's a communication problem between FBI headquarters and a regional office. So the way the FBI is still distributed today, but they just communicate and operate differently, is all of these regional offices distributed throughout the major parts of the country were given leeway to operate what they thought were the most important parts within their region. And then, like I said, as you have this central headquarters that just was not approving these warrants in a timely fashion to get access to this computer that would have given us a lot more insight. But I'll throw it back.
Yeah, no, it's just one of those things where, when you read the 9/11 report, or you read something like The Looming Tower, which is sort of like one of the best journalistic books on 9/11 still today, that was written in 2006, these sorts of things, they scream through the text, and it still gets you angry to read it today, because they had one of the pilots right there arrested, interrogating him, and they needed a warrant to get into his computer, and they would have found that he's getting money from this gentleman, what's his name here, Ramzi bin al-Shibh, who was helping coordinate from Afghanistan through to the other pilots and help funneling money and communicating back and forth. And they would have seen that he had this connection back to one of the Cole bombers as well. It was all there in the computer. but it was right there, but they couldn't get to it. And so he gets arrested, but this is something that the leadership in Al-Qaeda understood, that this was kind of he was a loose cannon, and they didn't know if they could trust him. And then, of course, he gets arrested. And so they say, okay, we need to move this plan forward immediately. So at this point, they had been moving the muscle hijackers into the country, again, unobstructed, easily, frictionless. They get all these other terrorists, mainly Saudi nationals, because it was easiest to get visas for them, moving into the country. And they were looking for, again, 4 teams of 5. And the last hijacker, the 20th hijacker, was a man named Al-Kitani. And he flew into Orlando, and he just kind of shit the bed during the interview process, right? When they were right there with the border agent, and the border agent could tell that something was up, and so he turned him away. Muhammad Atta was waiting for him on the concourse level, waiting to pick him up, and that would have been the 5th hijacker for Flight 93. That would eventually crash in Pennsylvania, but as the Looming Tower says, with him went any reason to wait. So it was time to move the plan forward. Moussaoui had been arrested, which is probably alarming them already. And then their last hijackers turned away. They feel like they need to move now, and so that's when we get to September of 2001. And this is just as the real threat is beginning to percolate at the highest levels of government. This is where sort of, you could say that there's, like the energy, the vibes, if you will. People are really starting to feel that something's going on, that CIA Director Tenet is allocated more resources to bolster his anti-terrorism efforts. And this is when another memo from Richard Clarke, again, the counterterrorism czar, is sent to Condoleezza Rice. And, at this point, he's close to resigning. He wants to be reassigned because he's so frustrated that no one's listening to him. And I want to quote from that memo again. And this is actually directly from the 9/11 Commission report. And this is dated September 4th, 1 week prior to 9/11. He writes to Condoleezza Rice, "The real question before the principals was, are we serious about dealing with the Al-Qaeda threat? Is Al-Qaeda a big deal? Decision makers should imagine themselves on a future day when the CSG has not succeeded in stopping Al-Qaeda attacks and hundreds of Americans lay dead in several countries, including the US. What would those decision makers wish they had done earlier? That future day could happen at any time." This is 1 week prior to 9/11.
It sounds to me like if I were sitting in that position, I mean, I've been in sales, as you guys know, for a long time. And one of the hard parts of the job is you have to go out there and meet people to sell things to. But at the same time, you have to also sell yourself internally. And the reason I say that is you have to convince your team to do what you want them to do, right? Make the project happen. It sounds to me like they were raising the alarms. I've seen in books and movies saying the red lights are blinking. And over and over and over again, these folks are telling people, specifically, in fact, Condoleezza Rice, I mean, is there a way that we've pointed blame? Was it unclear? Did it have place, means, method, all of these kind of things, or the strings just were 90% there but not 100% there?
I think yeah, those are the key missing details. A lot of this intelligence, because even a month ago, and the whole year, I think it's important to understand the backdrop. This entire year of 2001 was regarded as one of the highest terror, level threat years ever on record in the amount of information that was coming in, but none of it was specific. And again, that speaks to the resources they had in terms of funding, the technology, and the amount of people. There just was there weren't enough people on the ground, and the technology wasn't there to be able to do it. Because, just as shocking as that story was, the September 4th memo, there was just a month before that, right? Bin Laden determined to strike in U.S. They say something to the principals here. The FBI is conducting approximately 70 full field investigations throughout the U.S., and it considers Bin Laden related, right? The CIA and FBI are investigating a call to their embassy in the UAE in May saying that a group of Bin Laden supporters was in the U.S. planning attacks with explosive. Other components of that memo mention about how they already believe that there's many actors and operators within the United States that could support the attacks, right? So this isn't, as Spencer mentioned earlier, this wasn't something that sprang up overnight. This was a decades in the making plan and mission ultimately. But the most important people, and we have to point to the captain at the ship ultimately at the end of the day. It was the presidential administration of the time. They were getting lots of warnings, and they just did not heed them. And it's maddening as you look back, because you say to yourself, how could you ignore something like that? But
Yeah, it's only with the privilege of retrospect, of looking backwards, that we can look at all this and go, how could you not act? And I guess what their excuse was, well, we were getting lots of threats. It was all disparate, and the actual details of the plot were not uncovered. No one came to George Bush or Condoleezza Rice and said there are terrorists in the United States planning to hijack planes, fly them into buildings. But there is a very, very horrifying account of the FBI agent that was, again, trying to get that warrant into Zacarias Moussaoui's laptop. And he apparently was, getting unprofessional on a phone call to headquarters and said, I'm trying to stop someone from hijacking a plane and flying into the World Trade Center. He's on record saying that. So this was a week before September 11th. And so this is this is where all the disparate information that we couldn't see the meta picture for was beginning to percolate up. And it was in the first week of September that the CIA said, all right, we need to take a look at all of these Arab men that are coming into the country and taking flight classes. And it's all starting to get pieced together. But it wasn't in time. The last chapter prior to the attacks in the 9/11 Commission report, it's called Time Runs Out. And it really feels that way in retrospect. It was like, all these people that are super committed and understand that something big is going to happen, something spectacular, in the words of George Tenet, CIA director at the time, is underway here. But, it's really worthwhile at this point to then back up and remember that the CIA knew that these terrorists were in the United States. And there's speculation from people that are close to this that the FBI was playing with fire, is that they ought to have notified the FBI, but in their hubris, again, a key lesson here from 9/11, and in the fact that they had such animosity towards the FBI, this was dereliction of duty that they didn't notify these people. And then what happens is, in August of 2001, the CIA goes to the FBI and says, oh, hey, by the way, we were tracking these guys, Midhar and Hazmi. By the way, we lost them. We need your help. Can you help us find them? They were in San Diego and we lost them. It's like, well, you're literally a year and a half late on all of this. So it seems to me that there's a lot of evidence that the FBI was flirting, or I'm sorry, the CIA was flirting with disaster here, and they thought that they could run these covert operations internally inside the U.S., and it got away from them, and it resulted in 9/11.
To sound very hawkish, I do, and not to to all of a sudden become a CIA defender here. I think it really speaks to, and this is the important lesson moving forward, is how unprepared we were. We talked about I-49 and Alex Station. Those were the key operational allocated resources to combating, what is the emerging bin Laden threat. A handful of individual analysts at the CIA, a few investigators.
There were
at the
6
FBI.
Arabic speakers in the whole entire FBI at the time of 9/11.
So you can imagine, like and to context, to tie it back into what I said before, we had the wrong intelligence apparatus. We were cutting funding, for political reasons, for optics, and the hubris in between the miscommunications between the agencies would lead us to this point. And I do want to forewarn viewers, because we are now heading into an extremely somber point of this, segment. We're going to start covering the day of now and the hijacking. So just to provide a bigger picture, as things were getting closer to the attack date, we talked about all these intelligence failures. It's kind of shocking. You can kind of see it on the map where all of these individual cells, right, for the individual planes that they planned to hijack, they began to move across the United States to the airports that they were, planning the attacks at. And now, Spence, I want to throw it over to you. This is the morning of 9/11, right? It seems like this normal day, and unfortunately, it's hard to describe it as this now in retrospect, but it's this perfect, beautiful day with this excellent visibility. It's almost really ominous as we describe and look back at it.
Right. So I'm going to invoke here now something that sounds kind of silly, but it's an actual theory of catastrophe analysis, which is the Swiss cheese theory, right? If you would take random slices of Swiss cheese and line them up all in a row, what's the probability that you would get one hole all the way through that block of Swiss cheese? And 9/11 is a hole all the way through that block of Swiss cheese. And one of those holes is just how beautiful it was on 9/11. There was a meteorological phenomenon known as severe clear, where it dawned crystal clear, unlimited visibility, not a cloud in the sky on the east coast of the United States. Perfect day for flying. If they had planned the attacks for 9/10, they would have been rained out, in fact. So 9/11 dawns, and these, if you look at the night before instructions, which were never meant to be found, they were meant to be destroyed in Muhammad Atta's bag when he flew it into the World Trade Center. His bags never made it on that plane, and that's one of the small pieces of evidence that we have from the hijackers in that day. And they were instructed to stay up all night praying and getting themselves ready for this attack. And to say, and just, cleanse themselves, get ready to do this. They were instructed to say a prayer every time they entered a new room. You could think that they were like at the airport, on the plane, when they took over the cockpit. They were instructed to say a prayer, and they're just getting themselves amped up, getting themselves ready, and commit to this and be welcomed into paradise. So, these 19 young men are, probably amped up in a way that's hard to imagine. And they get on their individual flights. Now, it's important to also note that at this point, there was, and this is mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report, there was not a single thing that the government did at any point that hindered the plan at all. Like they arrested Zacharias Moussaoui and they sent away al-Qahtani at the border there. But that just helped, move things forward for them. There was even to the point of airport security, again, another hole in that Swiss cheese. They were all able to get on their planes, no problem. They tripped some alarms in that they had some rudimentary sort of alert systems known as CAPS, which alerted them, basically these are suspicious folks getting on the plane. But the only thing that changed was that their bags were loaded after they got on the plane, because they thought that if they were going to, blow up their bags, they would never do it with themselves on the plane. So that was the thinking of the security apparatus at the time. So, Mike, please, feel free to jump in on any of this. But there were 4
I have
teams.
a question.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't it true that we also were aware that hijacking was of an increased risk, right? We were kind of aware they're planning to attack. We didn't know where or when, but we did know that there were people that were attempting to hijack airplanes or talking about hijacking airplanes. And how on earth do you even plan to hijack an airplane? Right? Is there a way to observe that, practice that? At
this point, hijackings, it's sort of this like Hollywood thing. They're going to hijack an airplane and then make their demands, and there's going to be a negotiation with, rational-minded individuals. This wasn't the case. This is not what they intended to do. They only needed the planes for, after the hijackings, they needed them for 20 to 30 minutes, really. That's all they needed to do in order to get to their targets. And so basically all these 4 teams, they get onto their flights, no problem. You've got Atta and Shahi. They both fly out of Newark. No, I'm sorry. They both fly out of Boston. They're both together at the Boston airport at the same time. There's no evidence that they saw each other at the airport. They placed a phone call to one another at that airport, though. But interestingly, and this is noted, that Atta and al-Omari, one of the other terrorists, they drove early at the crack of dawn. They drove to another airport to fly in to Boston. So there's no good explanation for this, but maybe they thought that security measures would be more lax. Not like it mattered for them at all. But they drove to another smaller airport. They flew in to Boston, where they met their other hijackers. And then you have the team coming out of Dulles Airport, which would eventually hijack Flight 77 and fly that into the Pentagon. And then the last crew was flying out of Newark. And so, there's certain twisted realities of the facts of that day, that Flight 93 crew, the hit crew, the terrorists, one of the last people to see the Twin Towers standing, flying out of Newark like that. It's a crystal clear day with perfect views to Lower Manhattan from that airport. But the Flight 93, they're the ones that got the short end of the stick. They were the crew of 4. They were missing their 5th operative. And we'll get to the story later, but all of these flights were delayed, but only by 10 minutes or so, except for Flight 93. Flight 93 sat on the tarmac for 40 minutes or so longer than it needed to, or that it was scheduled to. And Flight 93's hijacking occurred later in the flight than these others, and that attributed to the fact that it didn't reach its target, which was most likely the Capitol of the United States, the Capitol building. So all of these terrorists made it onto their flights, no problem. They had their weapons, which were box cutters and knives. There was some aerosol sprays on some of these teams, and all of it made it through security, no problem. And this was we say pre 9/11 because it is obviously we're talking about 9/11, but the security measures at the time, they were not designed around safety. They were designed around economics. They didn't want to interrupt anyone from missing their flight. It was all about filling those planes up with as many people as they could. So security measures were extremely lax. So
what is an aerosol can dangerous for on an airplane?
Pepper spray.
Yeah,
irritant.
exactly, like an ocular irritant, exactly. Try to blind people and disable them. So that was definitely a key problem, because part of how they knew what to do was because during their preparations they flew many cold flights around the country, and through trial and error process they figured out that within the first 15 to 20 minutes of the flight they have the best time to get into the cockpit. It's going to be unlocked. They didn't even bring tools to anticipate breaking in behind those locked doors, as noted by the 9/11 Commission report. And as Spencer noted, in the pre-9/11 environment, it's kind of a colloquial term now because the world and security measures had changed so dramatically. You were allowed on with box cutters. There was no restrictions, nothing regarding aerosols. The FAA was lobbied to not put in many of these security procedures because, as Spencer noted, this was an interruption to passengers getting onto their planes, and we would come to see them as key failures now, and that's why our planes are filled with air marshals and cockpits are reinforced and locked like that. Flight 93 really stood out because they were able to do something about it because the timing was different on that. All of the other hijackers, the other 3 teams went off almost flawlessly, exactly accordingly to plan. They were able to infiltrate the cockpit and take control. And then as we go through a little bit of the timeline here, what's really alarming is then also how unprepared the FAA and the air traffic control apparatus was. There was just so much confusion at the time. Any hijackings before this event, all of them preceding this event, were some sort of hostage negotiation at the end of it, and often governments would rely on special forces and SWAT teams to be able to de-escalate the situation or neutralize the threat. They didn't envision suicide bombers and hijackers killing themselves and using the planes as weapons. So there's this incredible amount of confusion going on in the air as these planes are coming off course, and there's, just listening to some 9/11 documentaries this morning, I think it's really crucial to throw in some audio here, is you hear the confusion of all the air traffic control around the country for this first 15, 20 minutes where everyone's off course. Nowadays, that would send up all kinds of, red flags and alarm. There was almost like a paralysis that just was, going through the entire system because people weren't ready to immediately accept that it was a hijacking. But a crucial mistake that kind of led the traffic control teams on to something being, very, very wrong was one of the hijacker pilots was seemingly trying to communicate with the passengers on his plane, but might have accidentally queued up and communicated to the the infrastructure saying, everyone just calm down, as long as everyone remains calm, nothing will happen, but if you try something we will destroy the plane. And this was the first instances that really sent off a lot of red flags throughout the community, but we just didn't have the apparatuses in place to respond to this threat. Even so,
yeah, I mean, if you're an air traffic controller and you get that message, I don't know what you do. You don't have the right to dispatch a F-22. You don't even have the time to get a F-22.
The whole point of 9/11,
passengers on board.
It was all designed to happen like that. And that, it was like before you even knew it, these planes were crashed into their targets. That was the whole idea, which is essentially what happened, except for Flight 93. So, Flight 11, which is actually the most deadly plane crash in history. It resulted in the deaths of over 1,000 people because it brought down the North Tower of the World Trade Center. But we might be getting ahead of ourselves. So the first plane to be hijacked is Flight 11, and the pilot is Mohammed Atta, operational field commander for 9/11 plot. And yes, he gets into the cockpit and he keys his microphone. He thinks he's talking to the back of the plane. He's saying, "Hey, we're going back." He says, "We're going back to the airport." He says, "We have some planes. We're going back to the airport. Don't endanger yourself or the aircraft." Just trying to like reassure people that this is going to be a standard hijacking, right? And to behave, cooperate. You're going to be fine as long as you do what I say, sort of thing. But he doesn't transmit that to the back of the plane. He transmits that to air traffic controllers. And so there's one of those individuals on the ground hears that and just is like, "What did I just hear?" And this is where the alarm starts ringing. But it's too late. He has control of the aircraft. He's flying it towards Manhattan. And he's flying it down the Hudson River. And he's following that geographic feature. And it's going to plant him right on Manhattan. And then from there, you can't miss the World Trade Center. So at 8:46 a.m. on September 11, 2001, the world changes forever when Mohammed Atta plows the aircraft into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at precisely nearly the same moment that United Flight 175 is being hijacked. And Shahehi takes control of that plane and starts diverting it towards Manhattan as well. So then just less than 20 minutes later, as the world is watching, as we're watching the North Tower of the World Trade Center burn, it's this unbelievable sight. And again, this is sort of like etched in our memory. It's a part of history. It's hard to imagine how unbelievable this must have looked to people at the time, in real time, watching the World Trade Center burn. And you could watch hours of footage of this, of cameras trained on that one burning tower and seeing the other plane come around from the south to hit the South Tower from the south side. And he hits the plane, or he hits the building lower. The plane hits the building lower, but at an angle. And this is going to be important.
It's also quite a bit faster. It's quite a bit faster. I think I read that the first plane hit at about 400. The second plane hit at about over 600 miles per hour.
That might be
a steep banking turn.
Right. That might be an over-exaggeration. But yeah. So, but what's crazy about this is that, number one, the entire world is watching. But number two, these are not like experienced, seasoned pilots. Every flight that you've ever experienced has been accommodating your comfort and your safety, right? You're not experiencing those crazy G-forces. The descent on Flight 175 was so extraordinary, and there's calls coming from that plane at that time that people are throwing up. And then you have to imagine there's people on that plane that see the burning World Trade Center and see that they're barreling towards it. Just an incomprehensible sort of situation to be in at that moment. But what's important to mention on the ground at the World Trade Center is the North Tower is being evacuated, and in the South Tower, there's an announcement that's made that tells people there's a situation in the other building, return to your office. So there are accounts of people in the South Tower that in between the two plane crashes traveled down from their 80th floor office down to the lobby, and security said, hey, go back upstairs. We're having an emergency in the other building. We can't crowd the mezzanine. And people were sent back up into the South Tower. The South Tower plane crash is something that is sort of the situation in that building. People are freaking out. They're there and they're watching their colleagues in the other building. They see the fire. They see people hanging out of the windows trying to escape the heat and the smoke. And there's what's known as the jumpers of 9/11. So you have to imagine these giant cylinders that the plane crashes. And when you see the plane crash, you see originally gray smoke, and over time that fuels the fires that's being fueled again by those office material, the chairs, the desks, the paper, and it's being funneled up through these buildings. So you can imagine people above the crash zone, and there are phone calls that come from the North Tower after that crash that are saying that, like, in immediate aftermath, saying, "Oh, we heard an explosion. Oh, we see some smoke coming up now." And it's just in the minutes afterwards where the smoke becomes so intense that's where you see these horrendous pictures of people hanging out of the windows on those top floors of the North Tower trying to get air. And it's impossible to imagine how, scary that is, and just like the intense heat and the smoke, and it's acting as a chimney, and it's all funneling up. And if you're running towards the stairwell, thick smoke, you can't even, get through it. It's quite an unbelievable situation to find oneself in. And then again, people in the South Tower
elevators.
are watching that happen. They're watching this happen from the relative safety of what they believe is happening. And there's sky lobbies in the World Trade Center. They had this, you might even know about this, is that they had this ingenious sort of like express elevator takes you to the sky lobby, and then local elevators that took you up even further. So the sky lobby was on the
Many high-rise buildings have that.
Yeah. And on the 70th floor of the South Tower, as was in the North Tower, but these people are congregating in the 70th floor trying to take these express elevators down. And you can imagine that they're jittery, they're nervous, they're panicky, but they're trying to remain calm. They're trying to get out of there. And Flight 175 comes in, and the airplane tip, when it crashes, slices through that sky lobby and just wreaks havoc on these dozens, if not hundreds, of people that have congregated there. And so there are actual accounts of people escaping that sky lobby. Only a handful did. But there are folks who saw that carnage and lived through it and were able to escape. But the point being, though, is that the plane crash on the North Tower knocked out all of the stairwells. So there was no escaping from up top in the North Tower. But the South Tower, I believe it was Stairway A, that there was a clear path from the crash site all the way up from the building all the way down. There was one stairway open, and there were a handful of people. Only something like 17 or 19 people were able to escape from the South Tower from above the impact zone.
I definitely want to talk about the gravity of what we just talked about and remind folks of the actual timeline. So it's a shockingly short amount, right? This was the design of the plane's operation was to just put us in shock and awe state and not be able to respond. And then I'll also touch on some of, I don't want to call them just failures yet, but they're lessons that we learned to better prepare our emergency services and our crisis response to these. So the first impact of North Tower, World Trade Center 1, occurs at 8:46 in the morning and 30 seconds. So at this time, the United States has no idea really what's truly happened just yet. Even the FAA and the traffic control and all the emergency response teams that are trying to figure out, these planes are off course, they still don't understand the purpose of it. They're not even sure that the plane that's crashed into the tower is one of the missing planes, because there's several now. And the system is fragmented, balkanized, if you will, at the time. They're all regional. So now you have separate regions trying to communicate with each other to figure out which of these planes are off course and that are missing. And in this time between 8:46 and 30 seconds, at 9:02 and 59 seconds, the second tower is struck. So everything we just described, this horrifying timeline of seeing what's happened, getting the go-ahead to go back up, because the conditions around the first tower, the North Tower, are horrific, right? Just the dust and unfortunately some of the carnage of what's going on. So they tell people to go back into the second tower, only for a short while later, but 20 minutes later, the other plane to come in. One of the really tragic things is the complete inability for us to have any kind of effective response to this. The way that those planes crashed into the towers, the design of the towers couldn't support helipad evacuations. There was no real response to actually being able to save all of those people, or as many as you possibly could. Every firefighter, police officer, and first responder that was going into the building those days was doing so extemporaneously. They knew that they had to go in and just try to get people out as fast as they could. As we know, looking back in some of their communications, they knew the towers were going to come down. They had no idea when the towers were going to come down. They knew their mission was probably going to be a one-way mission at some point, and they knew that this was the call to duty. This was the sacrifice that they were asked to make, and was the whole purpose of all their training. And I really want to take a moment to honor the heroism of those people, because like I said, everybody who was going into those towers and the response areas had very strong, suspicions that they probably weren't going to eventually come out, but they were going to try to save as many people as they can. The first responders didn't have, they just weren't given the plans to be able to respond to this. So the people, tragically, who are calling above the impact zones are calling into 911, and this is a really, horrific story for me. This gentleman calls in and he asks, like, what should I do? He describes the conditions, has zero visibility. It's smoke, fire everywhere. The woman is, operator at the time who takes his call is kind of so panicked and overwhelmed. The entire 911 call system is completely overwhelmed. What does she do? She says, excuse me, hold on a second. I need to transfer you to somebody. So, I can't imagine, what's going through your mind, but apparently this guy kept himself very calm, and he talked to a second person describing his exact conditions again, can't see, can barely breathe, yada, yada, yada. She says, oh my God, hold on, I need to transfer you to my supervisor. And could you imagine the horror of being in these conditions to now be transferred to a third person? And allegedly this is the supervisor. He gets a hold of them and he says, I'm paraphrasing here, but he's like, I'm not going to repeat myself. You're going to listen to me and you're going to do what you're supposed to do. You're the first responders, right? So he describes the conditions again and he hangs up. All of the calls that are being fielded to these people above the impact zones, they're not given any kind of clear instructions about what they're doing. They're told to remain where they are until they can give them information, which we look back on was, a tragic failure in an opportunity to try to get as many people down from the impact zone below. But unfortunately, as we know also too, many of the egresses were not, available or visible to them. So many people were trying to go up when and were getting directions to go up when there was no means for a helicopter evacuation because of the structure of the roof and things like that. So these are horrifying, tragic stories that we use to fuel, our investigation of what happened and to be better. But unfortunately, this is just, a handful of the issues in our crisis response. FEMA has no idea how to respond to something like this. Our military apparatus and what would soon become joint task forces that we would use later, they're all regional and balkanized. They're not really designed to handle a nationwide, threat in real time like this. So that is just bringing us only 20 minutes into this attack. And then at 9:37:46, the Pentagon has the third plane crash into it. I can't imagine what the leaders of our country are going through in this moment, and this is something that they're recorded as thinking about is, when is the next one? How many more are on the way? I can't imagine being caught blindsided like this and then trying to, in such a short amount of time, mount a crisis response to this, as well as an intelligence investigation into such an active crisis. But I've taken the microphone.
Well, no, I think that's a great point. And there are people in the Pentagon. You have to imagine they're watching the TV and they're watching the towers burning, and they're saying, "Oh my God, there might be other attacks." But we're in the Pentagon. We're safe here, right? And so, Hani Hanjour, who was the fourth pilot who happened upon that Al-Qaeda camp at the right time to be sent into America to carry out the planes operation, as it was known. He crashes Flight 77 into one of the faces of the Pentagon, and the Pentagon's response was wholly different than that of the World Trade Center, because the World Trade Center was occurring hundreds of feet into the air. But there was already a coordinated plan among the disparate agencies of the National Capital Region to respond to something of this nature, not quite, this specific, but it happened at ground level. So they were able to get into the building and get people out. And there was probably less fatalities and injuries than would have happened otherwise. So it was a more manageable scene for an extraordinary sort of catastrophic day. But there's evidence to suggest that the Hani Hanjour did sort of a victory lap over over Washington, D.C., because it was his understanding that Jara should have crashed his plane into the Capitol building by now. So he was. There's evidence to suggest that he wanted to look for the burning Capitol and kind of take that in before completing his mission and crashing it into the Pentagon. But again, his flight was delayed, and so that didn't happen. So Flight 77 goes into the Pentagon, but at the same time, there is a fight for Flight 93 over the skies of America. So again, Flight 93 sat on the tarmac for an extra 40 minutes. And the hijacking itself occurred way later into the flight than the other flights. And so there was just far more of a time delay. And there's now an understanding that those passengers on Flight 93, through the phones on the plane, were able to get in touch with people on the ground. And they're saying there's a coordinated terrorist attack, they're crashing planes. And this is what informs the passengers of Flight 93 to take what might be some of the most heroic action taken in American history, which is to seize the plane back from the terrorists, with obviously the intent to maybe control it themselves and maybe land it. But they had a very clear idea that their plane was going to be used as a missile. And there's a lot of alternate timelines for how 9/11, could have been avoided, as we talked about earlier. But there's certainly another timeline in which Flight 93 reached its target, which was most likely the Capitol building, and just how much more devastating that day could have been. And, talk about the attacks to the symbolic heart of the United States, to lose the Capitol building that day.
Economic, military, and then political seat of the government all in one day would have, it's hard to believe how much more shocking it could have been to the American psyche, but that surely would have been one way to do it.
And all of this happened in less than 1 hour that morning, when most people aren't even at their desk in their office yet.
Right.
I can imagine how stunning this was to the entire U.S. government, and then the witnesses to this all, the firefighters. There's communication problems. They're trying to go in between the towers. Some of them are finding themselves in the wrong tower. It's just absolute chaos, but everyone is trying their absolute darndest to save as many lives as they can. So, I do want to snap back to the towers, because there's just, a couple more horrifying but as well as heroic stories of people going in there. One of the first things that the first responders are confronted with is burn victims in the lobby, because jet fuel, fired down the elevator shafts and burned victims on the first floor. So some of the first things that they're seeing, it must seem like either like hell or war zone or something like that. And now you have to ascend dozens of stairwells, because most of the elevator systems are disabled and out and unreliable at this point.
Yeah. There were no working elevators in the North Tower, but there was an elevator that took you to the 44th floor sky lobby in the South Tower, and a chief by the name of Oriel Palmer led a crew up to that 40th floor and then raced up the 30 some odd flights to the sky lobby of the South Tower. And they are the only accounts of the first responders reaching the crash site in the South Tower, and just the carnage that they must have seen there, unbelievable. And of course they perished in the collapse of the South Tower. But the South Tower holds many harrowing stories otherwise. So there was a gentleman named Wellis Crowther. He was a 24-year-old who was working on the 104th floor of the South Tower. And he had been trained as a volunteer firefighter. And he was known as, afterwards, the man with the red bandana, because he kept the red bandana in his pocket at all, wherever he went. And he used it to protect himself from the smoke on that day. But he was a firefighter in the tower on 9/11, just happened to be there, and he was able to use his training to help direct people down to the only available stairway, which was stairway A in the South Tower, and help the only people to survive from above the crash zone in the South Tower.
My gosh, we've got only 1 hour in time where all of these buildings were hit. And of course, we know that the South Tower was the one that collapsed first. Mike, that happened at almost 10 a.m. Am I right?
So that's right. So the South Tower, just a minute short of it, 9:59, almost ominous how it happens right before. And then this is just a few minutes before Flight 93 crashes from the heroic revolt that was going on there. But I think Spencer was just tying in a moment ago. It wasn't quite necessarily a successful revolt in the sense that they took control of the plane, but they were able to avoid it from reaching its target.
Yeah, that's right. So if we're talking about 93, so essentially it's communicated to the passengers on board that there is this simultaneous multiple hijacking occurring, that they're flying these planes into buildings, that they're suicide missions. And these passengers, a handful of them, have to make an unimaginable decision, which is to take fate into their own hands and to not let this passively happen to them. And there's a famous moment from Flight 93 where Todd Beamer, he's talking to, I think it's some random airline agent, because he's not talking to like the authorities or leadership, but he's just talking to whoever he get a hold of at the airline, and he famously says, "Are you ready? Let's roll." And that's the last thing he says, and there the revolt begins, and the passengers attack. And we don't know. We don't know the details of this, but as far as we can tell, the passengers attack the terrorists that were in the cabin. And remember, this flight is missing one of its hijackers. So this is where it all plays in together. It was overtaken late. It was late on the tarmac. It took off late. It only took off it took off moments before the North Tower was hit, and they hijacked it later. And there's a lot of speculation on Jara, who was the guy who had a wife, and he was like kind of like the most normal of the hijackers, where people didn't see this coming. He had friends. He seemed like a relatively normal individual. So maybe that like you could imagine he's sitting in his seat, and just kind of like procrastinating, thinking like, am I really about to do this? And those moments actually changed history. But the passengers start their revolt, and there's accounts of family members who would later listen to the black box, and the audio has never been released to the public, so we don't know. But they have accounts of listening to, basically they could hear the terrorists kind of like screaming in agony in the cabin because they're being overpowered by the passengers at this point, and the passengers are ramming one of those carts into the door to break into the cockpit, which has been locked at this point. And it's reported that they were chanting into the cockpit, is sort of like trying to get into the cockpit of this plane. And they're 20 minutes outside of DC at this point, and the terrorists in the cockpit are saying, "Oh, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? We should put it down." And they did. Just as they're breaking into the cockpit, just as they realize that it's all lost, they invert the plane and crash it into Pennsylvania. And where it did crash was in this reclaimed mine. And so it's not like natural soil. And so it was this kind of particular kind of sediment that essentially ate the plane, that it like absorbed so much of the impact, and so much of that plane was found underground. So that's why it's a very curious sight when you take a look at the images of the Flight 93 crash site. It doesn't look like a plane crash. It's like a burning, smoldering hole in the ground. And there's a lot of accounts from those first responders that were puzzled as well. They get there and like, what even happened here? But there again, I believe that there ought to be a plaque at the Capitol building with the names of all of the passengers of Flight 93, because that building owes itself to what those passengers did on the morning of 9/11.
Yeah, well, the QAnon shaman might have stolen that when he walked in there. The truth be told, though, I think that if they hadn't had the delays, right, then the families on board wouldn't have been, or the families of those on board wouldn't have been able to alert them of this, and potentially no revolt would have even happened.
The whole point of the plot was that these planes were going to take off within moments of each other, minutes of each other, and that they were all going to be hijacked within the 15 to 20 minute time frame, and that the attacks would have been carried off like in 45 minutes to an hour after takeoff. It all would have just happened like that, and it all happened simultaneously with no time for any interference from the government or the military. But Flight 93 was a curious one. They sat on the tarmac really late into their delay, and they decided to overpower and take over the plane later into the flight than these other flights. So it could have ended very, very differently that day. And I live in DC, and I look at the Capitol, and I would say most times I see the Capitol building, I think about 9/11 and how we came this close to losing the Capitol on that day.
Wow. So within the same 30-minute span, we've now got the South Tower collapsing, Flight 93 going down. The Pentagon was hit about 30 minutes prior to that. And then 30 minutes after that time, the North Tower finally collapsed. And
right. And I think it's... sorry. I just think it's really important to note. Mike had mentioned before. Maybe some people understood that the buildings might collapse. I mean, but there was so much happening at the time that no one could really plan for that, and they were sending firefighters into the building. And there's heartbreaking footage of this like lines of firefighters making their way into the South Tower minutes before it collapses. They had set up a series of triages right on the plaza in the immediate vicinity of the towers. These people that think that they've escaped this tragedy and they're being tended to on the sidewalk, and then the building starts to come down. Pretty unimaginable. And I think from the accounts that we've read, it's you look at the footage and it's like it looks like one thing, but from the accounts of it, it was almost like a liquid. That cloud was so thick that it was, when it wasn't just like walking into a fog, like people were breathing in matter, and that it was pieces of the building. You're talking about concrete, asbestos, chairs, right? People, paper, all of that stuff, combusted material, all of that just in this like toxic mixture. And deserving of a whole other episode is the fact that this led to myriad cancers down the line. And, we still deal with the effects of 9/11 today on those first responders and those victims that have to live with these diseases.
Yeah, no question. Well, one tragedy turned into another, and we're still living with the horrors of all of those occurrences. Well, guys, today was not an easy topic. There's obviously so much more to pick up on this topic based on movies, documentaries. We're going to leave a list of references that we use, books that we've read, specific items of pieces of media, even shows like The Looming Tower, I think on Hulu, is one that really explains the interworkings of the government and the intel agencies. And so hopefully you guys learned a little bit about what's going on here. Now we've gone the rise in episode 1 of Al-Qaeda, the attacks on the United States in this episode 2. Next week, we're going to have the privilege and the honor to interview someone from the very intelligence community that was in the George W. Bush Air Force One. And with him, he was the daily presidential briefer of President Bush during September 11th, 2001. The former twice acting director of Central Intelligence, no, I'm not kidding, Michael Morrell, will be interviewing him next week. So we're really looking forward to getting to see then the aftermath, because what we saw today was the attack. Next week, we're going to cover the aftermath with someone that saw it from the inside, not only inside, but the lead up and the aftermath. So guys, thank you so much for coming on today. I'm really, really grateful for everything you've put into this just to prepare. What we've talked about offline a little bit, just so everyone can understand this, is we're coming on a period of time where people that are graduating high school or even graduating college aren't aware of what happened in the country to the extreme level of what it was, to the level of unification that we experienced. And heck, I was only in 4th grade when it happened. And right now, as this theme goes on where, hey, could something like this happen again? We're looking at this political divide. We're looking at this partisan politics that goes on every single day. And there is no doubt in my mind that as a citizenry, as a government, we are distracted with things that truly and wholly do not matter. But what we are not solving are those problems that could potentially prevent something like this again. The border crisis, right? The intelligence communities going after domestic targets, maybe more so than they are on foreign targets. And those are my right-wing perspectives, of course, but these are things that need to be addressed and need to be talked about because something like this very easily could happen again. So, guys, what do you want to leave us with, if anything?
Yeah, before we leave this here, I just want to recommend that people, there's really, really great material on this. So the 9/11 Commission report, it reads very well. It reads like a great narrative. And so I recommend that people dig into that if they want more information. There's The Looming Tower, which is an incredible piece of journalism. And it's told through a Hulu series as well, which it has to consolidate things and, dramatize some things. But if you really want the information, go to the book. There's The Only Plane in the Sky, which is by Garrett Graft, I believe. And then also there's Perfect Soldiers, which is written by Terry McDermott as well. And that's where I've taken a lot of this information from, among many documentaries that you can find online. So if you're interested in this material, just dig into it, and you'll probably find a lot of interesting and troubling facts as well. And I guess to kind of like tie it all together, to your kind of big theme here is this looking forward, can this happen again? We owe it to ourselves to interrogate what happened and to remain incredulous and remain angry by what happened on 9/11, to inform how we can build better processes and systems and actors in government in order to protect ourselves. As we sort of opened with, we all live in the shadow of 9/11, whether we want to admit that or not, whether we like it or not. And it's a lesson to all of us that that hubris, that laziness, that interpersonal bickering can result in catastrophe. In the wake of 9/11, it was united we stand. And just as there are young folk today that don't remember the events, they don't remember that piece either. And it was all coming together, and it didn't matter, like we were all American, and we were all stood shoulder to shoulder, and we were all ready to embark on the war on terror together. And we all put our faith in the government to prosecute that as well, which is a whole other series I'm sure you can get into. But it's just a reminder that we are capable of amazing greatness, but also amazing disaster when we allow the worst part of ourselves to come to the fore rather than the best. So it's been a privilege to chat with you guys. Thank you for giving me the assignment. And I look forward to talking with you more on some other topics maybe down the line.
Awesome, brother. The pleasure is ours. Mike, what books do you recommend on this topic? Because you're very well read as well.
So very many that Spencer recommended, but I recommend this one for the layman here. This is the Terror Timeline. So this is actually a really good book put together by a citizen journalist, Paul Thompson, and he worked with the Center, I forgot off the top of my head here, the Center for Cooperative Research. And what makes this book very, very interesting is that it is all of the news articles from over time. So you can just sort by subject, and you can understand the entire timeline of the 9/11 attack. So everything we talked about today, all this, the memo of this and that person at this time, prior to all the bombings at the embassies, the USS Cole, all of that, the Bajinga plot, all that information is here in this book. So if there's only one book that you really can read, you don't have the time and the bandwidth, I really recommend this one because it gives you the chronological aspects to the story there to really understand the multiple failures before and then leading up to on the day of.
The other way that you could learn about this stuff is watching episodes 1 through 4 of our special 9/11 series. And this will conclude episode 2, guys. So please tune in next week for that special interview with Mike Morrell, the former deputy director and former acting director of Central Intelligence. We can't wait for that one. But thank you again, Spence. Thank you, Mike. This has been Elevated Thoughts.
George Tenet asked me to be George Bush's first daily intelligence briefer, and I started briefing him on January 4th, 2001. In the first briefing that we had done for George Bush, Al-Qaeda and bin Laden was one of the major topics. We start getting threat reporting about a big attack coming, multiple simultaneous attacks, history-changing attacks,